Hello, everybody. Welcome to Remix Austin, March 6th, 2024 edition. I'm Brooks. I run the Remix Meetup with Grant, who is doing all the food. Speaking of which, if you're in person, you're gonna get food, feel free to get food or get seconds at any time. I'm pretty sure I over-ordered per usual. I work on the Remix team at Shopify, so if you have any questions or comments or concerns about Remix, feel free to talk to me afterwards. But also there's lots of folks in this room who have used Remix or familiar, so it's a really good place to, just to bounce ideas off of people or just get help if you're struggling with anything or whatever it may be. We do have a website, so remixaustin.com. I'm going to be honest, we haven't been doing as much with this as I'd like to. We're a little bit behind. Specifically, we still need to upgrade to Beat. We have a lot of work to do, so it's several versions behind. So if you're ever in need of open source work to do, feel free to reach out there. But there's another guy in the community who's not here tonight, Seth. There's two Seths, so I'm actually forgetting his last name right now. I think it's Seth Davis. You what? Yes. His build's on Remix, yes. For better or worse. No, I'm just kidding. Seth Davis and I like to, we've been collaborating on some ways to make it a little more interactive and try and make it a little bit better. So I'm hoping to do a little bit more work there. It just is unfortunately at the bottom of the priority list. So if this is something you want to help with, if you are looking for something a little bit open source, but not too big of a commitment, please do reach out. And then I also will say that we're always looking for talk ideas. So here's a bunch of just ideas that, these are pretty evergreen. I think I wrote this maybe 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, and it's still all true. This is always the stuff that we're kind of dealing with in the web in general. I pretty much just take a bunch of web topics and then put Remix at the end of all of them because that's just the reality of web. Is we're always working on accessibility and internationalization. We actually have a new internationalization post on the Remix website right now. Always, trying to learn about cookies and server-oriented stuff, optimistic UI, styling strategies, MDX, all sorts of stuff. This definitely could be updated because there's new stuff, and I will update it at some point, maybe next year, we'll see. And so with that being said, I'm actually going to pass it to Mark, who's going to be talking to us about Performant Remix and how to make sure that your Remix website is performant.
So I'm going to be talking about performant websites with Remix. These are basically some techniques to make your website or web app load and run faster. These techniques are inherent to how sort of the web and browsers work. So they're a little bit different than what you would think about in a native app and performant techniques that you might be using there. And so this talk we'll talk about the technique, why it works, and then which levers you can adjust in Remix to take advantage of these techniques depending on the needs for your Remix app or sites. Hi, I'm Mark. I'm a UX designer and a developer, and I make exploratory prototypes with code. My pronouns are they, them. And you can find me on Mastodon or GitHub there. So first I want to say that these techniques are not always applicable for necessarily every website or every web app. Every website has its own constraints that may dictate something unchangeable about its architecture, how it's loaded, where it needs to run, where and how its data can be fetched, and more. There's this really great blog post by Jason Miller, the creator of React, titled Application Holotypes, A Guide to Architecture Decisions. And it basically breaks down the major website categories that you'll see across the modern web landscape and talks about the ideal strategies for implementing them. The techniques I'm going to talk about tonight mostly apply to these more content-heavy sites with sprinkles of app-like interactions. Things like marketing sites, social media sites, reference and index sites, storefronts, and news sites. So things like Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Amazon, more of these sort of shallower session depth, smaller interactions. They need SEO. They have sort of more of these requirements. And as you get farther down this list of holotypes, you get more and more interactive, and these techniques will apply less and less for web apps with heavy client-side interactions that rely on things like WebAssembly, GPU rendering, image manipulation, this sort of offline stuff like Figma or web games. These techniques might not be right for those. So what are we optimizing for? Simplicity, I think, is a big one. Discoverability, which includes SEO and things of that nature. And then initial page load, which is really important for these things, especially for the things like storefronts, where you have, like teams at eBay who spend all of their time building a custom framework to make sure that their site loads instantly, because you can lose customers if you are sitting there waiting for your page to load and you decide, oh, I'm gonna go find this somewhere else. So how do we achieve these goals? Do as much work on the server as possible. Put your servers as close to your users as possible. Send as little data over the network as possible. Always ship HTML to your users. Make pages work before JavaScript loads, and embrace web standards and browser defaults to help them do a lot of the work that they're designed to do rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So talking about doing as much work on the server as possible, if you fetch your data on the client, you're doing a client-rendered app or an app that does primarily its data fetching once the JavaScript has downloaded. You have to fetch your data on the client. You can't load your images until it loads the data. You can't load the data until you load the JavaScript. You can't load the JavaScript until the document loads. There's this crazy waterfall effect that happens here. And this is really tough in specifically React sites. A lot of React components will do fetching within the component. And that really means you have to wait for everything to download first before anything can run. And so the user's network is also a multiplier for every single step in this chain. All of this stuff is happening on their device. They're really just downloading the code in order to then run it on their local device. And so always fetching on the server will remove the user's network as a multiplier everywhere else. When you do your work on the server, you can start fetching immediately when the request is received. You don't have to wait for the browser to download the document, then download the JavaScript, parse the JavaScript, execute the JavaScript. And it doesn't really matter how slow the user's network is because your server's network is always consistent. And this image here is from it's a fairly old blog post on the Remix site, really comparing Remix to Next. And this is Next, I believe, using their SWR package, which is primarily fetching within components, versus Remix does a lot of their work on the server. So Remix is really designed with this in mind to have a lot of this work done on the server. They have these loader exports for each route. Loaders only run on the server. They, if on initial page load, they will load the data into the server rendered HTML, which gets output, but on subsequent navigations, they basically do a GET request to the loader in order to get that data to populate the next route. And then Remix also has actions, which are really great built-in mutation methods. Actions also only run on the server. They handle, the post, put, patch, and delete, and they can provide like error validation data back to the site, again, just via requests, but the action is running always on the server. And then the action can also trigger a revalidation where if the action is run, the loader will also run again. So any data you updated in your database will then be fetched again from your loader and revalidated on the page. So then put your servers as close to your users as possible. Long-running servers and serverless functions tend to run their code in a single region. And depending on your users, that one region, US East or US West, could be really far away from where they are. There's a lot of country in between the coasts. And that could mean a long time before your server even starts fetching the data. But by utilizing an edge network, you can deploy your site on servers in dozens of regions around the world. This is a map of Cloudflare's edge network. They have tons of these servers everywhere. And these servers are sort of a more constrained environment. They run this stuff in a smaller server. They have, it's not like a full Linux environment, but it lets you run your code really close to your users in a lot of cases. And maybe you can't deploy to the edge if you have certain restrictions. I know there are restrictions in like education about where your data has to be, and it's got to be centralized. You can't have it distributed among a lot of servers, but there's still the possibility that you could render at the edge even if you're fetching from a centralized location.
Probably, you might even cover this, but keeping your web server close to your DB server, another pretty important thing, although that could very well be on this next slide.
Yeah. So one of the things that we can do with Remix is we can put it at the edge. One of the really cool things about Remix is it was built around all of these web standards, and so you can create these adapters for almost any JavaScript runtime. There's Node, obviously, but then there's also things like the new JavaScript runtimes like Dino and Bun, but then also things like Cloudflare Workers, which are a completely different, it's basically just a JavaScript isolate that they have a few APIs for that you can interact with that are all built on web standards as well. And so this is an example of it's a simplified example of a adapter for Cloudflare where you can create this request handler using your build files. You create a simple function to handle the event if it's an asset or if it's a request for a server page. And then you can really just respond with that function in your event listener for fetch events. So because Remix is built on all these web standards, you can build an adapter for almost any JavaScript runtime, including most edge runtimes. You can deploy your entire site at the edge with something like Cloudflare Workers or Pages, or with something like Vercel's config export, you can actually determine what is deployed where. So this config export here at the top of each route will let you specify what runtime on Vercel services you want to deploy that route. So you can deploy everything at the edge, but let's say you have some code that you need that is using a Node-specific library that can, it's designed for Node, it uses one of their native modules like FS or something, and so you can't run that at the edge in this sort of more constrained runtime. You need the full Node runtime. But then your nested route doesn't have any of those requirements. It's just loading data, maybe using a fetch call, and that's about it. And so it would still benefit from being on the edge. Well, with the Vercel integration here, you can just change the runtime of one of your routes to Node.js. That'll run in Node, and the rest of your routes you can still specify if you want to run them at the edge. So then send as little data over the network as possible. This is really important because of the sort of connectivity gap. There's a lot of people who are now using smartphones as their primary devices. There's a lot of people in rural areas that don't have great access to internet. One of the things I do at my day job is I work with an ISP, and there's a big push right now to sort of fill in a lot of the gaps in the rural areas where there's like not even DSL out there right now, and you may be dealing with people with satellite internet, dish or something like that, could be really slow. And as smartphone ownership and use grow, the front ends that we deliver remain mediated by the properties of those devices. The inequality between the high end and the low end is only growing, even in wealthy countries like the US, you can see here. And so what we choose to do in response defines what it means to practice UX engineering ethically. So one of the ways we can take advantage of sending as little data over the network as possible is nested routing. So with nested routing, you may have a route for each section of the screen that changes. So you have your root route, which would include everything on the page. Then you may have a sales route like here, where it's just this part aside from the sidebar, where it has sales. You may have invoices, which is just the part of the tab that is invoices. So when that changes, it could change to subscriptions or customers. And then you may even have more specific inside of that, specific invoice ID routes for each of the invoices here and what they display over here. Taking advantage of nested routing means that on every subsequent navigation, instead of going to the server, fetching all of the data for everything again, every time anything changes, re-rendering all of that, sending it back down, with nested routing, we only have to fetch the data for the route that's changed. If the other routes haven't changed via navigation, then we don't need to fetch that data. So this is a great way to send less data, and Remix does this by default. And you can take advantage of it just by architecting your site to use these nested sections depending on how your layout works. And then this is one that I'm pretty excited about, partial hydration with React server components. So this is not in Remix today, but it is something that's an active RFC. So you can go to the GitHub repo and discuss this with them there. I believe they're still working out how this will work exactly, but the idea here is we can, when you have a website that is server rendered, you have to hydrate it. And basically that means you download the HTML, then you download the JavaScript. The JavaScript then sort of traverses the HTML and adds event listeners and any, runs its code, any interactive things that need to happen on the client. It attaches those to the HTML. But with partial hydration, you only really need to hydrate the things that are interactive, the things that are actually going to be used on the client. If you have these really static HTML bits that aren't doing anything, there's no reason to send the code for them to the client because they're not going to change anything once they get there. So React Server Components sort of solves this in a way. It enables this partial hydration. And the way it'll work in Remix is you can actually create these components that are server components. They may be async components, but they just don't have any client-side code in them. And so those you can actually just return from your loader. And this is really important because it helps with that waterfall as well. When you're doing everything in your loaders will load in parallel based on the routes that they need. And so you avoid some of the waterfalls that like Next.js gets into with their implementation of React Server Components, where you can just await within components. You sort of get back into that issue of fetching within components. This lets you fetch within components, but then you're returning them from your loader, so they all load at the same time. They can load in parallel. And then you can just use these, returned from your use loader data, these components inside of your client app. And so then the static header, the static async render markdown to JSX component, these don't need to ship any code to the client at all. They're just sending the HTML because they'll run entirely on the server. And then the only thing that needs to be hydrated are the things that are actually in the client, the things that may be interactive, like the suspense fallback with the loading article fallback, that maybe it runs some code in order to determine how many times to spin the spinner or something like that. But really, you're saving data here because you're only sending the code for the things that'll be interactive, and you can keep the static stuff purely on the server. So then ship HTML to your users. Websites should work as soon as you can see them. This is progressive enhancement. It's been sort of a core tenet of good web development since the web and JavaScript, I guess, has been around. Apps that are rendered entirely with JavaScript are waiting for the scripts to download and execute before anything is displayed to the user. So you have your HTML, you may have just a single script tag in there that references your JavaScript. That'll download pretty quick. And then it's going to start downloading your JavaScript, and that'll download, parse, and execute. And then your JavaScript is going to start downloading your data. And then once all of that is done, the user finally sees something displayed to them. But HTML will download and display quicker than JavaScript, and it allows more parallel execution, especially with streaming. So you can start rendering your HTML, start streaming that to the user at the same time that you are rendering the data. And then you can also start sending down the JavaScript. And because all of this is happening in parallel, you end up rendering the page a lot quicker than if you were doing it mostly client-side. So HTML and Remix by default, Remix server renders all routes, which is really great. It's one of my favorite things about Remix is that it's really server first. But you can opt out of this, depending on your needs and use cases. Maybe you have something that's stored in local storage. You want to respect the user's privacy. You don't want to set up a server on your end, and so you can use these client loader and client action exports, and these are a pretty new feature of Remix that's really cool. And then they also give you this hydrate fallback, which allows you to display something to the user while this is happening. But the great thing about this is with the hydrate fallback, you're not just shipping a blank HTML page that has a script tag and then loading all the scripts and just waiting on this blank page to see something before it loads. You can still ship HTML to your user. And so I want to talk a little bit about the user experience of that and sort of the design side of creating a good hydrate fallback for this. So displaying your app's UI shell the moment that it loads, and then quickly replacing it with your first screen allows you to give users the impression that your experience is fast and responsive. The ideal hydrate fallback, I think, is effectively invisible to people because it simply provides a context for your initial content. So instead of it being like an onboarding experience or a splash screens, an opportunity for animation or something like that, its primary function should really be to enhance the perception of your experience as a fast and ready-to-use website. And so the HTML you export from your hydrate fallback should be nearly identical to the HTML on the first screen of your app. If you include elements that look different when the data finishes loading, you could see these flashes of content, things sort of moving around, and it can be kind of jarring for the user. So an example of this is a small little recipe app that I'm working on that does a lot of data saving on the client side, and so it's pretty heavy on the client. But this would be essentially the hydrate fallback experience here, where you're always going to see this all recipes sidebar item, you're always going to see this table header, you're always going to see the import recipes button. Those things aren't going to change based on the user data. But then when the user data loads in, it just sort of fills in the gaps that were left there. And so it can make your website feel pretty quick versus just having this blank page waiting for everything to load and just pop it all at once. So the next, make your pages work before JavaScript loads. Well, why would we do that? I mean, everyone has JavaScript, right? Well, not everyone has JavaScript, and it's not necessarily because they turned off JavaScript. If your page hasn't loaded yet, all of your users are non-JS while your page is loading. The HTTP request could not succeed for the JavaScript if they get on a train and the connection goes away. It could just not go at all because of browser bugs or things like that. I mean, I know I've had that happen in mobile Safari a bunch of times, where you refresh the page and suddenly everything's working again because it actually downloaded the JavaScript. Corporate firewalls, mobile networks, interfering with those kinds of things, different micro browsers, embedded browsers that may not have the same permissions or things like that. So there's a lot of reasons why users might not have JavaScript. Oh, come on. And the data layer of your site should really function with or without JavaScript on the page. So if you're fetching everything and doing all of your mutations with client-side JavaScript, that can be tough, especially if your endpoints are not set up in a progressively enhanced way, where you're using a form that's hitting the right endpoint in order to actually make the mutations happen. And this will just make your website feel faster, because even before the JavaScript loads, if you click on a link or submit a form or anything like that, it'll work because that's how HTML works. And this is all part of progressive enhancement. So Remix is really great about progressive enhancement. This is a code snippet I actually took from their source code. I simplified it a little bit, removed some of the stuff that was extraneous. But the idea here is their link component, which is what you use to do client-side navigations between things, actually really just returns an anchor tag. And it passes on the href and the target. And so even if this click handler isn't loaded by JavaScript, the stuff rendered in the server-side rendered page is still going to have these anchor tags with the correct URL and the correct target to navigate to. And so even if your JavaScript didn't download, this anchor tag is still going to work for you. And the same thing is true of the form component. Again, this is from the source code, simplified a little bit, but the form component just renders a form and it passes on the method and the action. And so even if the handle submit JavaScript doesn't get downloaded, hasn't been downloaded yet, you're still going to be able to submit this form using the browser defaults and HTML defaults that forms come with. And so finally here is embracing web standards and browser defaults. So things like form, like I mentioned. There's also link with rel prefetch, which is a great way to make your website feel performant by preloading things. URLs for assets, I think, are really important for that link part of things, because if you have your assets at URLs, then you can prefetch them versus having your assets in code where you have to download the code, execute the code to get the assets. And then there's this cache control directive, which is really cool and sort of encouraged by Remix. So the link rel prefetch, the way this works in Remix is you can use it on a standard link component. So if you have a link component that is going to render something that is really important, you can just put a rel prefetch prop on it, and it will automatically prefetch all of the stuff needed for that page when they navigate to that page. And then there's also this prefetch page links component, which sort of does that just automatically for the entire page. If you know this is going to be a high volume page that I know people are going to go to from this page to that page, you can just preload it sort of in concert with the other page. And then there's the cache control. It's really just an HTTP cache directive. And you can do this in Remix using this headers export. This headers export can be at the beginning of or on any route. And so you can define different headers for different routes. But this cache control, and specifically the stale while revalidate, is really cool because the result of this is really a static document. And if you're using a CDN or an edge server, it's a static document that's cached at the edge. And so instead of fetching all of the data, rendering the pages to static documents at a build deploy time, the cache is really primed when you're getting traffic. So documents are served from the cache and then revalidated in the background by running your server functions again for the next visitor. So it's similar to static site generation in that no visitor pays the download plus render cost when you're getting traffic, but it doesn't require any special build setups. You don't have to do any specialized ISR things or anything like that. And so the stale while revalidate cache directive is a great alternative to static site generation, and many CDNs support it today. So that's my talk about performance and Remix.
Mentioned this at the beginning, but yeah, I just wanted to give some quick highlights of things that have happened in the Remix world. And also, this is so tiny. That's huge. All right. So yeah, some things that we've done recently. We've talked a lot about, if you've been to any of these meetups, we probably have talked about Vite for a while. So Remix is fully migrated, or not fully migrated, sorry, we released our Vite plugin, which is, if you're not familiar with what Vite is, it's just a basically a build tool set, essentially. It kind of is sort of like what Webpack was, but anyway, it's really fast, really nice, got a lot of plugins, etc. So we've got a bunch of different like blogs about that. This was our original one, and then we've got a more recent one about going stable and what that kind of took. So that's going to be like the default going forward for Remix, which is pretty cool. So that was a big one. And then we also, where did it go? Not that one. I don't know where it is, but we also finalized spawn mode. So if you don't like server-side rendering for some reason, if Mark didn't convince you that you should be server-side rendering for a lot of cases, or if you look at oh man, forgetting his name, the Preact creator.
Jason.
Thank you, Jason. If you look at his blog and you're making one of those things that kind of fit into that, it's like, oh, I should use a spawn or whatever. Remix now has a spawn mode, so this is a really easy way to like just build like a purely single page app. So you just have an index HTML file. That's the only thing that's actually server rendered, but it's only at your build time, and then everything else is it's just like Create React app, which is what I grew up on. So pretty cool.
Can I say that I have a little quibble with this name, and I would like to change it to CSR mode, because spa mode is all of Remix as a spa?
Yeah, well, also all of Remix is client-side render too, so it's very confusing. All names are bad. We did discuss this. Some people use the term pure spa, which is very confusing, because what does that mean? I agree, it is a bad name, but there's not a better one in my opinion.
I've just seen a lot of confusion for people online around like, oh, Remix is totally multi-page apps, and now they finally added a spa mode. I'm like, that's not what happened.
Yeah, we should probably clarify that a bit.
Like PowerPoint, spa-final. This is the final thing we're gonna call a spa.
Yeah, exactly. And then in 2.8, not a lot more happened, just some random dev stuff. So this is the main two updates.
Layout?
Oh, what are we looking at? Oh yeah, I did forget about that.
That looks very
it's a new layout export also. Yeah. So this export basically inside of kind of the way that Remix apps work is you have like nested layouts, right? So you have your root layout. So the problem is the root layout doesn't have its own like layout. It is the layout. So if you ever switch between the root layout component to like an error boundary, which is like what happens if an error is thrown, or the hydrate fallback, which is what you talked about with client loaders. Previously, there was not a good way to share the layout in between those, so we just added support where you can export like a layout function. So just another little nicety. That's very helpful for like your head not getting re-rendered, which could cause a flash of unstyled paint going between an error boundary and a component. So not only did your app blow up, but it also blew up in a very unpretty way. So that was not great. Yeah, base name support was another thing people were asking for, which is like a very small thing, and some Cloudflare stuff. So those are the main things. Unpick, I was mentioning this, right, as this is kind of the framework agnostic kind of image CDN handler, which is nice. You do need a CDN for this, but it knows how to like talk to all of them, which is nice. So I would recommend looking at this guy. They've even got like why you should use it with Next, their opinions, of course. But they've also got like unpick live and some lower level stuff to where if you really want to like kind of do what Next sort of does, where they like will optimize it for you on your server and everything, they've got some stuff around that. So yeah, I think that's the main stuff. Like I said, our blog, we've got a couple new posts. So we open source our website. That was fun. So if you want to put up a PR, do that. Bunch of Vite stuff. And then also if you've ever had to work with internationalization and Remix, we had a guest author from Storyblock write this article that we just released today, all about internationalization. She gives kind of 3 strategies for how you can do that well in a Remix app. So that's under something, and sorry if you're not familiar with what that means, that just means delivering localized content like in the language of the user. So if you're a Spanish user, if you're a Spanish speaker, you'd prefer a website to be in Spanish. If they've internationalized their website, then you can receive that text in Spanish instead of English or whatever the default may have been. All right, that's all I've got. So thanks everyone. Feel free to hang out. We got about half an hour in here, but thanks again to Mark for the great talk.